Okay, I'm just start out by taking refuge. And if you'd like to do this with me, you're welcome. I'm just putting my palms together. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. And I take refuge in the Sangha. We're going to look at case 11 in the Book of Equanimity, the Shoyoroku. And this case is entitled Ummon's Two Sicknesses. And I want to say right from the outset that I'm no expert at understanding these koans. They have a lot of facets to them. And you may have some insights that you wish to share as we discuss this, as you read it. So please don't think that I have all of the nuances of these Shoyoroku, these Book of Equanimity koans. I certainly don't. Every time I look at them, I'm finding different things. And so this is just an invitation to explore them, to question them, to try to understand, what is this all about? And some of them come across really enigmatic. So we want to kind of dive into it. Personally, the enigma surrounding these koans, I find it helpful for engaging my own curiosity. Like, what is this actually saying? And so I think these koans easily invite us to question. And that's always a good thing when it comes to religious literature, right? To not be really clear about what it's trying to say. A lot of times we come to religion because we want some answers. And one of the beauties about Zen is that it allows us to ask questions, and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, there may be some answers given along the way, but primarily it's about asking the questions and being curious. So let's look at this. We'll look at the preface to the koan, the introduction. A bodiless person suffers illness. A handless person compounds medicine. You wonder right away, how can somebody who doesn't have a body have any illness? Or how can somebody without any hands pound medicine? A mouthless person takes a meal. A non-receiving person has ease and comfort. Tell me, for incurable disease, what's the prognosis and treatment? So we're going to look at, like, what is illness? What does it mean to be sick from this perspective? And this is not saying that there are, this isn't talking about the sickness necessarily of when we get a cold or when we get COVID. Right? That's the kind of sickness, but this is talking about a kind of spiritual sickness. And this is a case talking about, in this case, it mentions actually 3 spiritual sicknesses. And so we'll look at that, but it's titled Two Sicknesses. Here's the case. Attention. The great master Ummon said, when the light doesn't penetrate completely, there are 2 kinds of sicknesses. Take a breath there. Just take that in for a second. When the light doesn't penetrate completely, there are 2 kinds of sicknesses. What does it mean? What does it mean the light doesn't penetrate? This may be a way of talking about our clarity, our level of awareness versus our level of ignorance. And by ignorance, I don't mean stupidity, but ignorance about the nature of the self. The great master Ummon said, when the light doesn't penetrate completely, in other words, there's not complete clarity, right? There's not the clarity of a Buddha. There are 2 kinds of sicknesses. When you're not quite clear and there are things in front of you, That's one sickness. Even though you thoroughly penetrate the emptiness of all dharmas, there still somehow seems to be something. In this also, the light has not penetrated completely. Again, there are two kinds of sicknesses in the Dharmakaya. Though you reach the, and here's the second one, though you reach the Dharmakaya, because Dharma attachment is not forgotten, and a view of self still persists, you plummet into the Dharmakaya side. This is one sickness. Though you penetrate this, if you are negligent, it's still no good. Even after a minute examination, when, however, you look at it, the question arises, what inadequacy can there be? This is also a sickness. This is a lot of, it's a lot of sicknesses here. So let's see if we can kind of chew on it. We're going to look at this. I'd like to look at this a couple of times, so not all in this evening. Let's look at this again. When you're not quite clear and there are things in front of you, that's one sickness. So let's take a look at this first sickness that's mentioned. When you're not quite clear and there's still things in front of you. One kind of sickness that's referred to here is the sickness of not having a path, not having, not knowing the way, the Tao, the Buddha way, the way of the Buddha, not knowing that there is even something called the Buddha way. That's one kind of spiritual sickness. To not know a path or a method of proceeding in life, right? And I mean, you could fill in the blank with, you could replace the Buddha Dharma or the Buddha way with another religious path if you want to. It could be the way of, it could be Islam, it could be Christianity, it could be Judaism, right? You can fill in that, but it could be something else. But the first kind of sickness that I think is being referred to here is not knowing that there is even a path. Okay, that's a less subtle kind of sickness. Some people actively choose to not have a path whatsoever, and that's also a path. So I don't want to negate that. I don't want to say that that's not a path. But let's just look at that first kind of sickness is not knowing that there is this Buddha way, that there's not a path to enlightenment. And so we drift kind of through life and we don't have an anchor. We don't, I feel so blessed. For example, I feel so blessed that when I'm in trouble in here, right? When my mind is confused, I know I can turn to the Dharma to seek guidance and seek wisdom. But what happens when we're confused and we don't have ourselves moored to any particular path? We don't have something that we can return to. And that's the name of, that's the meaning of the word religion. Religare means to return to or to bind back. And so we need something. We need, as human beings, there's some innate drive to find our center. And paths like Buddhism help us to orient our life. We need orientation, right? Because the waters of the lake get ripples on them and then we can't see clearly. So we need to get some orientation, like what's happening, make sense of it. But the sicknesses that this koan is talking about are more subtle than that, much more subtle. And in fact, I think they can help us with our meditation practice. They give us some insight into how to practice. Once we're already on the path, once we've settled, we've kind of made felt some clarity or some confidence in taking refuge in the Buddha Dharma or whatever path that you take refuge in. Once we've found some certainty there, like like, okay, there's something good here that I can follow, then now how do I practice? Now the question arises, well, how do I practice? And let's just look at, there's a lot of ways to practice, but let's confine it to our meditation practice for now, because that's what we've just been doing. We've just been sitting a little while. So here's the first sickness. The first sickness is that when we're sitting, we still have this idea of a self. We still have this idea. So we might know that we're on the right path. We might know, like from a Zen perspective, that we are Buddha. We might have that in our mind, in our awareness. We might, and when we come to sit, yet we still have this idea of a self. The idea of a self, like I am sitting here. That's a sickness. Now it's different from the sickness. It's not a mental illness. It's not a physical illness. It's a spiritual illness. It's a spiritual sickness where there's still this idea of a self, right? We haven't gotten rid of the idea of self completely. There's still a little vestiges of it. Even sitting like a Buddha, that's what we're doing when we're sitting in Zazen, we're sitting as a Buddha, but there might be some residual awareness of a self that's here. And so when we look at the introduction to this koan, it says, a bodiless person suffers illness. A handless person compounds medicine. It's like we're almost like we're fooling ourselves, thinking that we're practicing, when really this idea, this incessant idea of self keeps arising in our mind. Right? We think that we're taking in food, but we haven't really opened our mouth or found the opening. And so, a mouthless person takes meals. That's what we're doing. If we're still aware of ourself when we're sitting, we're not really sitting. If we're still aware of ourself, we're not really sitting. And so now here's the question, is like, how do we get rid of these thoughts about self, these incessant thoughts about self? And that's a whole nother, right? That's something we can explore together. The second sickness, I think we'll wait for another time, but let's explore this question, like how do we dissolve the self? How do we get rid of the self while we're in practice? Now, this is very, very subtle kind of practice we're talking about. And the next sickness, the second sickness, is even more subtle than this first one. So just to kind of give you a heads up here, just to give you a little bit of heads up. But let's look at this question. How do we actually practice in such a way that there is no self? What does this actually look like? What are some, because this is very, if we really dive into this koan, it's very practical for our meditation. When we're sitting, there's an idea of a self that inevitably crops up. For me too, right? So what are the ways that we can let go of the self? Zen Master Dogen says to study the way is to study the self, right? So it's not about getting rid of the self like an obliteration. That's not what it's about. So study the way is to study the self. So it's not completely, it's not like we should get rid of the self. It's not like the self is bad. But then the second line he says is to study the self is to forget the self. So how do we do that? All right? How do we do that? That's the question.